The Havana sky burned in shades of crimson and gold as Che walked along the Malecon, the salty wind tugging at his jacket. Cuba was alive with the noises of revolution. Children shouting in the streets, vendors calling out the day's catches, and somewhere, a radio blaring revolutionary songs he had once sung with fervor. But tonight none of it reached him. Tonight, Che felt like a ghost haunting a land that had already moved on without him. The decision to leave had not come lightly. Cuba had been his home, his battlefield, his triumph. Yet victory in Havana no longer tasted sweet. The revolution he had nurtured, fought for, and nearly died for was taking a life of its own. Leaders emerged from the shadows, shaping the ideals he once held dear into pragmatic compromises he could neither condone nor confront. He had tried to guide them, whispering the eternal truth of the fight for justice, but whispers had little power against the roar of politics and fear. And so, he left, not out of cowardice but because the fight had grown too small for the scope of his vision. Packing his belongings had been a silent, lonely ritual. Letters to Fidel and comrades remained unsent, folded neatly into envelopes he could not bring himself to give. Each photograph, each medal, each token of the past seemed to whisper accusations. You abandon us. You leave us behind. Che's hands trembled slightly as he closed the trunk, the echo of his own heartbeat filling the quiet room. He remembered the night in Cuba when the whispers first reached him, tales of a struggle brewing in the dense jungles of the Congo. Rebels, mercenaries, political upheaval, a new battlefield for a man whose ideals would not rest. The mission was dangerous, almost suicidal, but it beckoned him like a siren in the night. To Che it was not merely a call to arms, it was the chance to salvage the honor of revolution itself, to extend its reach beyond borders and betrayals. As he boarded the small, dimly lit plane that would take him across continents, he felt the weight of isolation settle like a stone in his chest. There were no farewells, no promises exchanged, only silent acknowledgments and wary glances. Those who might have walked with him in spirit stayed behind in Havana, watching the silhouette of their revolutionary hero vanish into the horizon. He looked down at the city lights fading beneath the clouds and wondered, would anyone truly understand why he was leaving? Would anyone follow his vision? Or was he destined to wander this world as a solitary crusader? Night fell over the Atlantic, and the plane shuddered through turbulence, as if the world itself questioned his decision. Che stared through the small window at the darkness stretching endlessly below. Thoughts tumbled in his mind. The people of Congo, a land he had never seen, waiting for guidance he could barely promise. The faces of comrades he might never see again. The cruel irony that he who had once taught courage, now wrestled with fear of the unknown. In the solitude of the cabin he took out a small notebook. The ink was smudged from travel, but his hand moved with urgency. Words poured out, half meditation, half confession. Reflections on idealism, on failure, on the inescapable loneliness of being a man consumed by a mission larger than himself. Each sentence was a thread tying him to the past he had left and the uncertain future that awaited. His mind wandered back to the jungle of his memory, dense forests, humid air, the constant hum of life and death intertwined. He had fought in mountains, deserts, and streets, but the Congo was a place unknown, a theater of chaos where human folly met nature's indifference. And he would go alone. There would be no cheers, no camaraderie, only the raw test of his endurance and conviction. The realization made his chest tighten. Here he would not be a hero. Here he would be vulnerable, isolated, perhaps even invisible. But Che welcomed it. He had never been content with comfort. Comfort bred stagnation, and stagnation killed revolutions. Every revolution he had touched had demanded sacrifice, and if he were to survive Congo, he would need more than courage. He would need obsession, ruthlessness, and the cold endurance of solitude. Hours passed. The plane hummed steadily, slicing through night and clouds. Che closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to imagine the jungle, to rehearse the conversations and confrontations that might come. Would the locals trust him? Would his own ideals be enough to guide men through chaos? He did not know. And perhaps that was exactly why he had to go. By dawn, the plane approached the African coast. Che pressed his forehead against the window, feeling the heat of the rising sun, imagining the green expanse of Congo below. He was a stranger in every sense, an outsider bearing dreams and fears like weapons, stepping into a world that might reject him at every turn. Yet in that moment he embraced the solitude. He was not fleeing Cuba. He was pursuing destiny, however grim or elusive it might prove. And so, with the first rays of light spilling across the jungle canopy below, Che became both hunter and ghost, leaving behind the land that had shaped him and stepping into the unknown, where chaos, disease, and betrayal awaited, but also, perhaps, the only place where his revolutionary spirit could truly be tested. The first glimpse of Congo from the small aircraft was deceptive. From above, the jungle stretched endlessly, a living ocean of green, broken only by thin ribbons of river winding like veins through the land. It looked serene, almost beautiful, and for a moment, Che allowed himself a brief, fragile hope. Maybe the mission would be easier than imagined. But the illusion dissolved as the plane descended into the humid air, thick with the scent of earth and vegetation, and the roar of the engines mingled with distant animal cries. The landing strip was little more than a clearing, hastily carved out of the forest, with wooden huts clustered at the edges. The heat struck him immediately, oppressive, suffocating, and the buzzing of insects filled the air with an incessant, irritating drone. Che stepped onto the soil, boots sinking slightly in the damp earth, and felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. This was no battlefield he could map with memory or instinct. This was a wild, unpredictable place, indifferent to ideologies, immune to his reputation. Local rebels approached cautiously, their eyes sharp and suspicious. Some bore the marks of struggle, scars, worn clothing, the exhaustion of constant vigilance. Others wielded weapons like extensions of their arms, ready to test him. Che had faced soldiers, guerrillas, and mercenaries before, but these men and women carried something different. An unfamiliar ferocity born of survival in a land where alliances were fleeting and trust was a luxury few could afford. He greeted them with a firm handshake, trying to convey authority without arrogance. Words were limited, language was a barrier. Gestures became essential, each nod, each measured glance a potential lifeline, or a signal of weakness. Che knew he was a stranger here, an outsider bearing promises he could not yet prove. And yet, he could feel the stirrings of curiosity, perhaps even respect, among some. They were sizing him up, testing him like the jungle itself. As the day unfolded, Che observed the chaos around him. Supplies were scarce, communication lines were unreliable, and disease, visible in the gaunt faces of men and children, crept silently through the encampment. Malaria, dysentery, fever. Each seemed inevitable, each a reminder that the human body was fragile when confronted with the relentless forces of nature and human neglect. He felt a pang of dread. Victory, he realized, would not come from ideals alone. It would demand endurance, cunning, and perhaps sacrifices he had not yet considered. Yet Che's mind refused to dwell solely on the physical challenges. His focus remained on the mission, uniting disparate rebel factions, training them, and leading an assault that could tip the balance of power. But every interaction, every meeting revealed subtle fractures. Mistrust, competing ambitions, egos clashing with survival instincts. He sensed whispers behind his back, the faint tremor of betrayal in half-spoken words. Here, in a land he barely knew, loyalty was fluid, shifting like the very rivers that carved the jungle. That night, he sat alone under a canvas shelter, the air thick and heavy, listening to the forest come alive in ways he had never heard. Nocturnal cries, the rustle of unseen creatures, the occasional snap of branches. It was a symphony of life and death playing just beyond reach. Che wrote in his notebook by the dim light of a candle, recording observations, strategies, and the fleeting fragments of hope that surfaced between waves of doubt. His pen moved almost unconsciously, as though by writing, he could tether himself to clarity amid the chaos. He thought of Cuba often in those moments, the streets of Havana, the revolution's chants, the camaraderie of comrades who believed in the same dream. Here there was none of that warmth. Each face was a mystery, each smile or frown potentially masking danger. And yet, in this isolation, Che felt a clarity he had never known. Without the comfort of familiarity, without the echo of his past victories, he was forced to confront himself entirely. The man who had once been a legend was now alone, vulnerable, stripped to the core of his convictions. The days blurred into a cycle of meetings, scouting missions, and training sessions. The heat, the insects, the incessant noise of the jungle wore on him, gnawing at patience and temper alike. Yet amid the exhaustion, Che found moments of fierce purpose. When he corrected a poorly aimed shot, when a unit executed a maneuver he had taught, when the rebels nodded at his instructions, eyes sharp and attentive. These small victories, fragile as they were, reminded him why he had come. He could still shape events, still fight for ideals that mattered, even here in a place that seemed determined to consume him. But lurking beneath every success was the shadow of doubt. Would they follow him to the end? Could he trust anyone entirely, or was betrayal inevitable? The more he observed, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to resist fitting together. And yet, for all the fear, all the uncertainty, Che could not turn back. He had left Cuba, left the world he knew, in search of a cause that demanded everything. The jungle might test him, the people might betray him, disease might strike him down, but retreat was not an option. As the sun sank behind the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the camp, Che allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He was alone, yes, but alive. And in that life, however precarious, he still had a purpose: to ignite revolution, to challenge oppression, and to prove, if only to himself, that ideals could survive even in the heart of chaos. The jungle would not yield easily. Neither would he. And so, Che stepped into the darkness, the alien cries of the forest wrapping around him like a shroud, feeling the weight of solitude settle even deeper. He was not just a man in a foreign land. He was a ghost moving among the living, unseen, untrusted, yet unbroken. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, painting the jungle floor in mottled patches of green and gold. Che awoke to the hum of insects, the cries of distant animals, and the muffled chatter of his recruits. Yet the beauty of the jungle did nothing to ease the growing tension in his chest. Every day, every interaction, seemed to confront him with an uncomfortable truth. Ideals, no matter how noble, often collided with reality in ways he could neither predict nor control. The rebels he had come to guide were a complex mosaic of human imperfection. Some were fierce and loyal, hearts burning with the desire for freedom. Others were opportunistic, willing to switch allegiance for a promise of food or coin. Che had believed once that revolutionary zeal could bind men together, that a shared vision could overcome fear and self-interest. Here in Congo he found that even the strongest ideals could falter under hunger, disease, and distrust. He watched a young fighter, barely 18, struggle to lift his rifle, sweat streaming down his dirt-smeared face. The boy's hands shook, not with fear, Che realized, but with exhaustion and sickness. Malaria had already taken hold in the camp, and no medicine was left to treat it. Che's idealistic plans, grand and precise on paper, were unraveling in the face of this harsh, unyielding reality. In meetings with local commanders, Che's vision often met resistance. They argued, sometimes violently, over strategy, territory, and supplies. The arguments were not just political, they were deeply personal, rooted in mistrust, ego, and the scars of past betrayals. Che tried to maintain patience, to guide with authority tempered by respect, but each clash chipped away at his confidence. He realized that leadership here required more than charisma or ideology. It demanded compromise, cunning, and an almost cruel pragmatism that he had never been willing to employ in Cuba. One afternoon, Che set out with a small contingent to scout a nearby village rumored to hold potential allies. The trek was grueling, the air thick with humidity, the path littered with roots that threatened to trip them, and the ever-present threat of disease or ambush. The men moved silently, wary, glancing at Che as though expecting him to lead them into disaster. And perhaps he would. The thought struck him with a cold clarity. His ideals could inspire, but they could not shield him from the jungle's cruelty. In the village, Che attempted to rally support. He spoke of liberation, of unity against oppression, of a vision that transcended borders. His words, filled with conviction, hung in the air for a brief moment, then dissipated. The villagers, wary and worn, listened politely but gave no sign of commitment. One man, older and scarred by previous conflicts, asked quietly, "And if we die? What then?" Che had no answer. He could promise ideals, but he could not promise survival. The question lingered like a shadow, gnawing at him as they returned to camp. Back at the encampment, frustration mingled with fatigue. The jungles of Congo did not bend to plans or principles. They demanded adaptation, compromise, and sometimes, the painful acknowledgement that vision alone was insufficient. Che found himself standing at the edge of the camp at night, staring into the endless darkness, grappling with a growing sense of failure. Every ideal he had carried into this land now seemed fragile, almost naive, against the overwhelming weight of reality. Yet amidst the disillusionment, Che's resolve hardened. Ideals, he reminded himself, were not meant to falter in comfort. They were forged in adversity, tested in chaos. And Congo, brutal and indifferent, was perhaps the ultimate crucible. He would not abandon his vision, he could not. But he had to adapt. Strategy had to temper idealism. Caution had to temper courage. Survival was no longer a secondary concern. It was the very foundation upon which the revolution might stand. Che began to notice subtle signs of betrayal, too. Whispers behind closed huts, averted gazes, men who lingered too long in conversation before reporting back. The realization was bitter. Loyalty here was transactional, fragile, and contingent. Even the fiercest convictions could be overshadowed by fear or self-interest. Che had once believed that the righteousness of a cause was enough to unite men. Here he learned it was not. Leadership required understanding human frailty in its rawest form, and exploiting it when necessary. One night, alone with the sounds of the jungle pressing in on all sides, Che wrote feverishly in his notebook. His pen scratched across the pages as he catalogued failures, observations, and plans for the future. There was no room for romanticism here, no place for the illusions of heroic grandeur. Every movement, every decision could mean life or death, not just for him but for the men who had chosen, however hesitantly, to follow him. And yet, amidst the exhaustion, the disease, and the creeping despair, Che felt the familiar fire of purpose. The ideal had not vanished, it had been tested, battered, and forced to evolve. Reality had stripped it to its core, exposing its vulnerability but also its resilience. The mission was harder than he had imagined, more perilous than he had prepared for, but it was still a mission worth pursuing. The jungle would try to break him, the men would test him, betrayal would stalk him, but in that struggle he would find the measure of his conviction. Che realized, with both clarity and sorrow, that the journey ahead would not be won by ideals alone. It would require endurance, adaptation, and a willingness to confront human weakness, not with judgment but with ruthless practicality. The revolution he had once imagined in the clear air of Cuba now existed in the shadows, in the heat and rot of Congo, and in the hearts of men who were as unpredictable as the jungle itself. And so, he steeled himself, ready to face the coming days, knowing that failure was a constant companion, and that the line between heroism and despair had never been thinner. The camp was quiet that morning, the jungle holding its breath as if aware of the storm about to unfold. Che had risen early as always, to inspect the perimeter and speak with his men. But the usual rhythms felt off. Eyes that normally held respect now darted nervously, conversations paused abruptly when he approached. There was a tension in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, like the faint hum before a thunderstorm. Che's intuition, honed through years of guerrilla warfare, pricked at him. Something was wrong. And soon he would discover how deep the rot ran. It began with a small incident. A supply cache he had painstakingly secured, ammunition, medicine, even a few meager rations, was missing. At first he thought it was theft by wandering locals or careless rebels, but as he questioned the men, a pattern emerged. Hesitation, conflicting stories, the quick exchange of glances. Someone in his midst had betrayed him. The realization hit like a blow. Che had left Cuba seeking a mission of purpose, hoping to rebuild the ideals of revolution in a new land, and already, the very men he had come to guide were undermining him. The betrayal was not abstract, it was concrete, dangerous. Every lost bullet, every stolen ration increased the risk of failure, of death, of collapse. He confronted the unit leader, a man named Kofi whose loyalty had seemed steadfast. Kofi's eyes flickered with a momentary hesitation that Che noticed instantly. "Who took the supplies?" Che demanded, voice low but firm. The jungle seemed to press closer, listening. Kofi's reply was cautious, measured. We do not know, Commandante. Perhaps stolen on the path. Perhaps taken by others." Che studied him carefully. The hesitation, the slight avoidance of eye contact. It was enough. He pressed further, voice rising, the calm control slipping. "Do not lie to me, Kofi. You have men under your command. Someone here knows. You will tell me or—" The man faltered, finally breaking under Che's unwavering gaze. He confessed. A faction within the camp, resentful of Che's outsider status, had planned the theft, hoping to weaken him and gain leverage over the command. The betrayal was more than practical, it was existential. Che had known the dangers of Congo, the unpredictability of human behavior, but the pain of betrayal from those he trusted, even minimally, cut deeper than any bullet. A sense of isolation wrapped around him, cold and suffocating. For the first time he understood the true loneliness of a revolutionary in exile. Not just the distance from one's homeland, but the distance from those who should walk beside you, the absence of allies you can trust completely. The consequences were immediate. The stolen supplies meant a planned operation to secure a strategic village had to be delayed. Men would go hungry, some would fall ill without medicine. Che could see the frustration, the fear, and the murmured doubts spreading like wildfire. The ideal he had carried into this jungle, the unifying vision of revolution, now seemed fragile against the raw forces of human self-interest. That night, as the men slept fitfully under canvas shelters, Che walked alone to the edge of the camp. The moonlight filtered through the dense foliage, casting jagged shadows. He felt the weight of every choice he had made, leaving Cuba, trusting these men, daring to bring his vision to this untamed land. The betrayal was not just tactical, it was deeply personal, a wound to the heart of his mission and his belief in the power of human loyalty. Che knew that action was required. He could not allow the betrayal to fester, to erode morale or endanger lives. Swiftly, he called a council with the senior rebels. Accusations flew, tempers flared, and in the tension, the fractious nature of the camp revealed itself fully. Alliances shifted in real time. Friends became suspects. Suspicion became a living, breathing presence in the room. By the end of the meeting, Che had made his decision. The betrayers would be removed from positions of influence, their actions documented and remembered, and trust would have to be rebuilt carefully, like a fragile bridge over a turbulent river. Leadership here required vigilance, decisiveness, and sometimes ruthless judgment. Ideals alone could not survive in the wilderness of Congo. As dawn approached, Che sat alone once more, writing in his notebook. His words were sharper now, tinged with anger and resolve. Betrayal, he reflected, was an inevitable companion of revolution. It could not be ignored, excused, or romanticized. To lead in such a place required more than courage. It demanded clarity, discipline, and an unflinching willingness to confront the darkness not just in the jungle but in men's hearts. Yet even in anger, a small ember of hope remained. The betrayal had not destroyed him, it had clarified his mission. If he could navigate the treachery, endure the isolation, and maintain his focus, he could still guide the revolution forward. But it would be a different kind of fight, one not just against oppressive forces, but against the fragility of human trust itself. Che rose at last, the morning sun breaking through the foliage, lighting the camp in muted gold. He would face the jungle, the disease, the rebels, and the unseen forces conspiring against him. And he would do so as both a leader and a ghost, moving through a world that seemed determined to betray him at every turn, but undeterred, unbroken, and ready for the relentless trial ahead. The Congo jungle had a rhythm of its own, indifferent to men, ideals, or revolutions. Each morning, Che woke to the same oppressive humidity, the same oppressive chorus of insects, and the same gnawing awareness that life in this place was precarious. The men around him fell one by one, succumbing to fevers that raged through their bodies like wildfire, to dysentery that left them gaunt and trembling. The weight of mortality pressed heavily upon him. Che felt the first stirrings of illness in himself, a headache that throbbed in time with his pulse, a dull ache in his muscles, a fatigue that sleep did little to soothe. He ignored it at first, refusing to admit weakness. A revolutionary could not falter. But the jungle had its own logic. Bodies could not sustain ideals alone. It demanded sustenance, rest, and immunity that were scarce luxuries in a place where even water was suspect. The camp's atmosphere shifted as sickness spread. Men who had once laughed nervously or argued passionately now lay in silence, too weak to raise their voices. Che moved among them, hands trembling not with fear but with helplessness. He had left Cuba seeking purpose, but here, purpose could not shield a body from decay. Each fallen man was a reminder of the fragile boundary between vision and survival. Che watched one of his younger recruits, a boy no older than 17, curl up under a tattered blanket, shivering violently. The boy's lips were cracked, eyes glassy with fever. Che pressed his hand to the boy's forehead. It burned. There was no medicine left to treat him, nothing but whispered prayers and the cold comfort of presence. The young soldier looked at Che with trust that he could not repay. The weight of responsibility pressed down, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every decision. Rations were scarce, hunting was unreliable. Che found himself rationing not just supplies, but hope itself, measuring encouragement against practicality. A wrong word, a misplaced gesture of optimism, could become a liability when men were weakened by illness and despair. The idealism he had carried from Cuba now felt almost obscene in the face of human fragility. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against them. Rain turned paths into slick mud, rivers swelled and swallowed campsites, and insects carried diseases invisible to the eye but lethal in their bite. Che's once pristine uniform was now tattered and streaked with grime, his face hollowed by exhaustion and worry. He moved like a shadow through the encampment, a man caught between duty and the inevitability of decay. Isolation weighed on him more than disease. In Havana, even in moments of tension or failure, Che had known camaraderie, the sense that men shared his burdens. Here, each cough, each groan, each whispered fear reminded him that he was utterly alone in his struggle. He could not lean on the men around him, their own survival consumed their focus. Che's ideals offered no protection against fever, no shield against infection, no remedy for the slow erosion of morale. As days bled into weeks, Che began to confront another harsh reality. The revolution he had envisioned was fragile, dependent not just on strategy or courage, but on bodies that could survive. Plans faltered not because of enemies but because of illness, hunger, and exhaustion. The men he trained with painstaking care were diminished by forces he could not control, and he was powerless to intervene beyond guiding and encouraging. The gap between vision and reality yawned wider with every passing day. One night, as the wind carried the cries of distant animals and the rustle of leaves above, Che sat alone, writing feverishly in his notebook. His hand shook not solely from the heat, but from the cumulative weight of loss, fear, and helplessness. He recorded the spread of disease, the failures of supply lines, the morale of his men, but also reflections on himself. He felt the sharp sting of mortality pressing against his ideals. Was revolution worth this cost? Could a man's vision endure when bodies, fragile and fallible, could not? Sleep came fitfully if at all. Fever dreams haunted him. Visions of comrades lost, of jungles swallowing the living, of battles fought for nothing. He awoke with sweat-soaked sheets and the faint echo of laughter from a world far away. Havana felt like another life, another person. He was no longer the confident, ideal-driven revolutionary who had left Cuba. He was a man reduced to survival, wrestling with decay, disease, and doubt. Yet even as despair clawed at him, Che refused surrender. The ideal that had drawn him to Congo, that had inspired men in distant lands, remained a flickering ember within his chest. It was fragile, weakened by circumstance, yet persistent. The mission could still be salvaged, but only if he embraced the harsh lessons of the jungle. Survival required pragmatism, vigilance, and acceptance of human fragility. Che moved among the sick, offering instructions, encouragement, and sometimes silent comfort. He could not cure disease, nor could he entirely prevent death, but he could act. And in action he found a measure of clarity. The jungle would not bend to ideals. Men would falter, betray, and succumb. But a revolutionary, even in decay, could endure. And so, Che persisted. Fevered, exhausted, and physically diminished, he continued to lead, a spectral presence amid the suffering. In the heart of the jungle, surrounded by the rot of illness and the threat of death, he discovered the raw essence of revolution. It was not victory or glory but endurance. It was not certainty or triumph, but the ability to move forward when all else decayed. The jungle had a way of swallowing men whole. Che had come seeking to shape history, to ignite revolution, to mold the chaos of Congo into something greater. But now, months into the mission, he felt like a phantom drifting through a world that barely noticed him. His presence was acknowledged, sometimes obeyed, but rarely understood. He moved silently through the camp, boots sinking into mud, skin slick with sweat and grime, face gaunt from fever and sleepless nights. Men would glance his way, nod respectfully, then avert their eyes, unsure whether to approach the commandante or to leave him to his solitude. He had become a ghost, both literal and figurative, visible yet untouchable, present yet distant. The forests pressed close around him, each rustle of leaves, each snap of a branch, sharpening his senses. Survival here demanded vigilance. Disease lingered in every breath of humid air, predators prowled beyond every clearing, and betrayal lingered like an invisible predator among his men. Che's body ached constantly, muscles strained from marches and skirmishes, yet his mind remained alert, calculating, always 2 steps ahead of both seen and unseen threats. He had learned to speak less. Words were dangerous. Too much instruction and men grew resentful, too little and chaos reigned. The balance between authority and presence was delicate. He began communicating through gestures, brief commands, and silent observation, letting action and example speak louder than speech. The men followed him because they had no choice, but also because, in some unspoken way, they feared the ghost who moved among them, eyes sharp, ever watchful. The nights were the worst. Alone in his tent, the sounds of the jungle pressed in. The calls of distant predators, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. Che would lie awake, thoughts spinning in relentless circles. Memories of Cuba haunted him, streets filled with chanting crowds, the camaraderie of his comrades, the taste of victory. Here none of that existed. Only hunger, disease, fear, and the relentless green of the jungle. He sometimes imagined the men he had left behind, wondering if they remembered him as a hero or simply as a man who had vanished. Even amidst his isolation, Che's mind remained a battlefield. Strategic decisions had to be made, sometimes under the constant threat of ambush, sometimes in the stifling heat of the jungle where every movement felt like a potential trap. He had learned to trust few, rely on even fewer, and to move with the calculated patience of a predator. The jungle itself became both ally and enemy, offering concealment and opportunity, yet threatening with every misstep. It was in this liminal state, between life and exhaustion, visibility and invisibility, that Che became more than a man to those around him. Stories circulated among the camp's men, of the commandante who appeared silently, correcting a maneuver without a word, of a shadow seen gliding through the jungle at dawn, surveying, watching, always knowing, of a figure who never slept, never faltered, who endured disease, betrayal, and hardship that would crush ordinary men. Che did not cultivate these tales, nor did he refute them. They were a tool, a cloak, a weapon. If the men feared the ghost, they followed. And in following, they preserved the fragile thread of revolution that remained. He had no illusions. Fear was a form of loyalty here, as potent as respect, as binding as ideology. The jungle demanded pragmatism, and Che had learned that survival, of himself, of the mission, of his vision, depended on harnessing the perception of power. The longer he remained in Congo, the more the lines between reality and legend blurred. Disease left his body gaunt, fever hollowed his eyes, and exhaustion weighed heavily upon him. Yet in this fragility lay a paradoxical strength. His vulnerability was invisible to those around him, his determination imperceptible beneath the surface, yet unrelenting. He was a man stripped bare, yet larger than life, a ghost threading through a living, breathing nightmare of green and decay. Che reflected on the irony often, that a man so driven by ideals could become something as intangible and spectral as the shadow he now cut across the jungle. Ideals demanded sacrifice, and he had given his body, his health, and the warmth of human connection. In return, he had gained clarity, endurance, and the eerie reputation of invincibility. The jungle, ever indifferent, had taught him a cruel lesson. Survival often required disappearing into legend, into myth, into a role that was part man, part shadow, part hope, and part terror. By midday, he would emerge again, walking among the men with deliberate precision, giving instructions, overseeing training, correcting mistakes. But he spoke little, listened more, and always watched. Every gesture, every pause, every calculated silence reinforced the image he had become. The ghost of the jungle, a man pursuing revolution in isolation, untouchable, unknowable, and unstoppable. And as night fell, the canopy closing like a vault overhead, Che felt the duality settle within him. He was alone, isolated, tested by illness, betrayal, and the merciless forest, but he endured. The ghost among men was not just a figure of fear or legend. It was a survival strategy, a mask to protect both the mission and the man behind it. The jungle, for all its menace, had forged him anew, weakened in body, distant in spirit, yet sharper, more focused, more unyielding than ever. Che understood, finally, that in the heart of Congo he was not merely a revolutionary. He was something else, a spectral presence, moving through chaos, disease, and betrayal, undetected yet indispensable, feared yet followed. A man without allies, yet more powerful than any army he could command. The Ghost of Congo. Night in the Congo was a living, breathing entity. The thick canopy above pressed down, hiding the stars and the moon, and the jungle's symphony of insect calls, distant animal cries, and rustling leaves surrounded Che like a cocoon of sound. He sat alone on a fallen log, shoulders hunched, notebook open in his lap, yet he did not write. Instead, he let his thoughts drift, unguarded, unstructured, and entirely his own. Cuba haunted him. He remembered the streets of Havana, the chants of the crowds, the warmth of comradeship, the fiery idealism that had once driven him with unwavering certainty. That Che, the young, confident, unshakable revolutionary, seemed almost like another man now, a ghost of his former self. Here in Congo, surrounded by sickness, betrayal, and death, he felt the fragility of all human endeavor pressing down upon him. His ideals, once luminous and unassailable, had been tested in the crucible of reality, and the results were sobering. He thought of the men he had led, the young soldiers who had trusted him with their lives, now sick, dying, or distrustful. Each face etched itself into his mind. Each cough, each fevered groan, each hollow-eyed stare reminded him that human frailty was the truest enemy of revolution. He could teach tactics, share vision, demand loyalty, but he could not protect them from disease, hunger, or the jungle's unrelenting cruelty. Che's mind wandered to the failures he had already endured, the stolen supplies, the factions that had betrayed him, the missions that faltered despite meticulous planning. Each failure gnawed at his pride, but more profoundly at his belief in the universality of ideals. He had assumed that men, wherever they were, would rise to the cause if it was just, if it was righteous. But here, ideals collided with survival instincts, and the collision left jagged scars, visible and invisible. Yet even in the despair, Che found clarity. The jungle had stripped away illusions. He saw that revolution was not merely a matter of charisma or righteous anger. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and acceptance of imperfection. Men would betray, sickness would strike, plans would fail. And yet, within that chaos, a committed leader could still carve meaning, could still direct the course of events, could still embody the ideal in action, if not in perfection. He reflected on the paradox of solitude. Isolation had been a companion from the moment he left Cuba, and in the jungle it became almost complete. The men followed his orders, yet few truly understood him. The few who tried often withdrew, intimidated by his intensity, or simply overwhelmed by the harsh realities of life here. Che had always believed in solidarity, in shared struggle, in the communion of purpose. But solitude had become his teacher. In it, he discovered the unadorned truth of his own character, the raw essence of commitment, and the stark vulnerability that no ideology could shield. Memories of victories and defeats in distant lands intertwined in his mind. Guerrilla skirmishes in the mountains, street battles in cities, the triumphs that once seemed absolute, all now filtered through the lens of this jungle. Victory in Cuba had been tangible, celebrated, complete. Here, however, every small gain felt fragile, impermanent, almost illusory. He realized that the world beyond Havana did not bend to ideals. It demanded resilience, patience, and often, the grim endurance of waiting for circumstances to reveal themselves. As he sat in the darkness, Che pondered the nature of heroism. He had been celebrated as a global icon, lauded for courage and brilliance. But what was heroism in a place like Congo, where survival itself was tenuous, where betrayal lurked in every corner, and where even the strongest men succumbed to disease and despair? Perhaps heroism was not measured by victory or fame, but by the refusal to surrender, by the stubborn persistence of action despite futility, by enduring when everything within and without demanded surrender. He closed his eyes and imagined the eyes of the young rebels in the camp, trusting, wary, uncertain. He wondered if they would remember him as a ghost, a figure of legend, or simply as a man who tried and failed. But even in uncertainty he found purpose. Ideals did not vanish because circumstances were cruel, they evolved. They demanded adaptation, pragmatism, and, above all, the willingness to endure when failure seemed inevitable. Che opened his notebook finally, the pen moving with quiet deliberation. He did not write of strategies or tactics tonight. He wrote of observation, of reflection, of questions that gnawed at his mind. What is the price of commitment? Of idealism? Of survival? Each word was a tether to his humanity, a reminder that despite the jungle, despite betrayal, despite decay, he remained alive, aware, and determined. The night deepened and the jungle pressed closer, dark and infinite. Che felt the weight of solitude, the ache of memory, the sting of regret, but also a quiet, unyielding flame of purpose. In reflection he understood something essential. A revolutionary's battle was never only with enemies, with oppressors, or with terrain. The truest struggle was within, against despair, doubt, and the erosion of one's own ideals. And it was in facing that struggle night after night, that the spirit of revolution endured. He closed the notebook, inhaling the humid air, listening to the symphony of the forest. For all its indifference, all its chaos, all its cruelty, the jungle had become his mirror, a test of endurance, patience, and unflinching commitment. Che rose slowly, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Alone, weary, haunted, yet unbroken, he prepared himself for another day of survival, of leadership, and of pursuing a vision that refused to die, even in a place that seemed determined to swallow it whole. Dawn broke over the jungle, casting a pale, trembling light through the dense canopy. Che stood at the edge of the camp, surveying his men. They were gaunt, weary, and infected with the slow erosion of months in this unforgiving land, yet there was a spark in their eyes, a fragile, flickering ember of hope. Today the mission that would define their struggle, perhaps even seal their fate, would begin. Che's plan was audacious. A strategic village deep in enemy territory was crucial to consolidating the rebel factions and gaining control of supply routes. Its capture promised not only resources but legitimacy. Yet the terrain was treacherous and the villagers were wary, their allegiances uncertain. Betrayal could come from any direction. the jungle, rival factions, or even men he thought he could trust. He briefed the small contingent carefully. His voice, though low, carried an authority sharpened by months of isolation, betrayal, and survival. "We move quietly," he said. "We strike swiftly. Every mistake will cost lives. Every hesitation can mean the difference between victory and disaster." The men nodded, faces etched with fear and determination. There was no room for doubt, not here, not now. The march was brutal. Thick underbrush tore at their clothing and skin, hidden roots tripped the tired soldiers, and the heat was suffocating, making every step a labor. Disease had weakened many, and Che himself felt the lingering aches of fever and exhaustion, yet he pressed on, moving like a ghost among them. His presence was both reassurance and warning, a reminder that they had a leader who endured what they endured and more. Hours into the march, Che's instincts screamed at him. The jungle seemed too silent. The usual chorus of insects and distant animal calls had vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. He signaled for the men to halt. Sweat stung his eyes, and his chest heaved with the weight of both fatigue and anticipation. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. Every rustle of leaves could herald an enemy attack. The jungle had become a predator, and they were the prey. Suddenly, gunfire shattered the stillness. A hail of bullets ripped through the underbrush and chaos erupted. Men shouted, ducked, and scrambled for cover. Che's heart pounded, yet he remained focused, scanning the edges of the clearing, eyes sharp for the enemy's position. He barked instructions, directing flanks, coordinating retreat and advance with the precision of a man who had long ago mastered survival in chaos. Amid the confusion, Che spotted movement. Figures emerging from the shadows, allies who had turned. Betrayal had followed him even here. The realization struck with icy clarity. Some of the men accompanying him had made secret pacts with rival factions, hoping to manipulate the outcome of the mission. Rage and sorrow coiled together in Che's chest. Trust, he had learned, was a fragile commodity, easily broken and devastating in its loss. Yet there was no time for despair. Che lunged into action, guiding loyal soldiers to strategic positions, returning fire, and taking calculated risks to protect his men. The battle was swift, brutal, and chaotic, a blur of gunfire, screams, and the sickly smell of sweat, blood, and decay. Every instinct honed in Cuba, every lesson learned in the jungles of Congo, was tested in these hours. Failure was not an option. The survival of the mission and perhaps the remnants of the rebel faction depended on it. By midday, silence returned to the forest, heavy and uncertain. Smoke drifted from scorched underbrush, and Che walked among the wounded, tallying losses, checking on survivors. Some had fallen, loyal men young and promising, carried by the jungle into death. Betrayers had vanished into the trees, perhaps escaping punishment, perhaps leaving trails that would haunt Che forever. Victory was partial, bitter, and earned at an unimaginable cost. Che felt the weight of exhaustion press against him. His body ached from fever, hunger, and exertion, yet the mission's completion, however imperfect, lent a strange clarity. Survival, he realized, was not simply about endurance or skill, it was about the persistence of purpose, the relentless pursuit of ideals even in the face of chaos, decay, and betrayal. Every step forward in this jungle, every decision made under duress, was an assertion of the revolutionary spirit he carried, a testament to the resilience of human will. As the sun sank behind the canopy, Che stood silently at the edge of the village, surveying the aftermath. The jungle, indifferent as ever, had reclaimed some of the ground, erasing footprints and scattering evidence. Yet the men who remained looked to him for guidance, uncertain, weary, and scarred, yet still capable of following. Che felt a mixture of triumph and sorrow, understanding that every victory here carried the shadow of loss. He withdrew into the jungle as night fell, the sounds of nocturnal predators filling the air. His body ached, and his mind buzzed with exhaustion and the ghosts of those who had fallen. Yet he pressed on, the mission, however fraught, however partial, accomplished. The ghostly presence he had become was not merely a legend among men. It was survival, strategy, and endurance manifested in flesh and spirit. The jungle swallowed him once more, shadows closing around him like a cloak. Betrayal, disease, and chaos had tested him, yet he remained, a spectral figure of determination and unyielding purpose, moving through a world that seemed determined to consume him. The final mission had ended, but its consequences and the trials that awaited were far from over. The jungle was alive with the low hum of unseen creatures and the distant cries of predators, but Che felt nothing but the stillness of isolation pressing against him. Days after the final mission, he moved through the dense underbrush alone. The few men who had survived the operation dispersed, tending to the wounded or consolidating the village. He had become unnecessary in their eyes, and perhaps, in a way, he had always been unnecessary. His purpose now was a private one, driven by something far deeper than command or strategy, the need to confront the ultimate consequences of his ideals. The sun barely penetrated the canopy, leaving him in perpetual dimness, a world of shadows and green. Each step was deliberate, cautious, yet urgent. The jungle had taught him the subtlety of survival, the need to move like a ghost, to make no sound, to leave no trace. And so he did, a man disappearing into a land that was vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to human presence. He remembered the betrayal, the disease, the failures, the gnawing realization that revolution was never a straight path, never guaranteed, and often cruel. And yet, something inside compelled him onward. He was not retreating. He was moving toward something he could not yet define, toward a resolution only the jungle itself might reveal. The men left behind would remember him as a leader, perhaps as a hero, perhaps as a phantom. But he had ceased to exist in their world. He had become part of the shadows, part of the forest, part of the legend that would outlive him. The forest seemed to close in around him, branches clawing at his skin, vines tangling at his feet. Sweat ran down his face, mingling with grime and the remnants of fever, but he felt a strange vitality. Alone, invisible, unbound by responsibility to others, he could move with a freedom impossible when leading men. Every sound, every rustle, every shadow was a potential threat, yet it sharpened his senses, honed his focus. The jungle demanded vigilance, and he answered with a singular, relentless purpose. At night, he rested in silence, hidden beneath the dense foliage, listening to the jungle breathe. It was in these moments that he felt closest to the essence of himself, the man who had left Cuba with fire in his heart, the revolutionary who had dared to chase ideals across continents. Here, stripped of comrades, of recognition, of comfort, he confronted the raw, unadorned truth. He was alone, and he had chosen it. Loneliness was both a punishment and a liberation, a reflection of the costs inherent in pursuing a vision larger than oneself. Rumors of his presence spread among the scattered rebel factions. Some claimed to see him moving silently through the undergrowth, correcting tactics without word, vanishing before anyone could approach. Others whispered of a shadow that appeared at dawn, guiding the lost, punishing the traitorous, disappearing into the trees before acknowledgement. Che had become more than a man. He had become a myth, a ghost of the revolution itself, an indelible specter haunting the jungle he traversed. The physical toll was immense. Fever still clawed at him intermittently, hunger gnawed constantly, and every step risked injury or death. Yet the psychological transformation was complete. The isolation had stripped him to his essence, body and mind in acute awareness, heart and spirit sharpened by suffering. He had become a man wholly defined by the present, entirely reliant on instinct, and utterly untethered from the past or the future. The vanishing was not an accident, it was a deliberate shedding of everything he had known, everything that bound him to the world of men and politics. Che's thoughts drifted often to Cuba, to the friends, comrades, and lovers he had left behind. He wondered if they mourned him, if they remembered him as a hero, or if he was already fading from their consciousness. But such thoughts were fleeting, quickly replaced by the reality around him. The jungle, alive and indifferent, demanded attention, respect, and cunning. To dwell on nostalgia was to risk death. To remain present, silent, and vigilant was survival. As days blurred into nights and nights into more days, Che's figure became indistinct even to the rare eyes that glimpsed him. He was a shadow moving through shadows, a rumor moving through rumor, a ghost among men and beasts alike. And in this transformation he achieved something impossible in Cuba or in any battlefield he had known. He became immortal in myth, untouchable in legend, yet tragically, undeniably human in the solitude that defined him. By the time any search parties ventured into the depths of the forest, Che was gone. Tracks faded, whispers faltered, and the jungle itself seemed to reclaim him entirely. The commandante, the revolutionary, the man of ideals and obsession. He vanished not with fanfare or spectacle, but quietly, irrevocably, into a land as indifferent as it was eternal. And so, the Ghost of Congo moved unseen, untethered, a figure of myth walking the line between legend and reality, a solitary witness to the fragility of human ambition and the relentless endurance of the human spirit. The world beyond the Congo would never truly know what had happened to him. In Havana, whispers persisted, fragments of stories carried by returning soldiers, scattered letters, and rumors that reached newspapers across continents. Che Guevara, the hero, the revolutionary, the commandante, had vanished. Some claimed he had died in the jungle, taken by disease or betrayal. Others insisted he had walked into legend, moving silently among shadows, a spectral presence guiding the fight for justice from the unseen edges of the world. In the villages and encampments he had touched, the stories were different. Among the rebels he became more than a man. He was the ghost who had appeared in moments of despair, who had endured when others faltered, who had guided, corrected, and inspired without reward or recognition. His disappearance did not diminish his presence. If anything, it intensified it. He became a symbol, an idea, a figure larger than flesh and blood, proof that ideals could persist even when the men who carried them could not. Historians and journalists would later attempt to piece together his final days, searching for records, eyewitnesses, and footprints in the jungle. But the truth remained elusive, obscured by time, the density of the forest, and the inevitability of myth. Che's journey could not be neatly documented or categorized. It defied simple narratives of victory or defeat. In life and in disappearance, he had become a paradox. Mortal yet immortal, human yet mythic, a man haunted by ideals and haunted by the failures of their pursuit. His personal legacy was perhaps even more complex. The ideals that had once burned so brightly in Havana were tested in the harshest crucible imaginable. Betrayal, disease, and isolation had forced him to confront the limits of human loyalty, the fragility of ambition, and the cost of pursuing vision without compromise. He had survived physically as a ghost, and metaphorically as an enduring symbol, yet the experience had transformed him fundamentally. The man who had once believed in the universal power of revolutionary ideals now understood that the world was far more chaotic, fragile, and indifferent than he had imagined. And yet, within that understanding lay the essence of his contribution. Che's ghost, whether in memory, in rumor, or in myth, reminded the world that ideals were worth pursuing even when they collided with insurmountable odds. That courage was not merely the act of battle, but the persistence of action when every circumstance demanded surrender. That heroism was not defined by victory alone, but by the refusal to abandon conviction in the face of betrayal, disease, and isolation. Artists, writers, and storytellers would later depict him in countless ways, as a revolutionary saint, a tragic hero, a cautionary figure, a ghost wandering endlessly through jungles of both geography and conscience. None captured the full truth and perhaps none could. The Che who walked through Congo, the fevered, exhausted, betrayed, relentless figure, was irreducible, a man whose complexity and contradictions defied simple representation. Yet the myth served its purpose. It inspired, provoked, and challenged generations to question the price of conviction and the endurance of ideals. In the silent villages he had passed through, children heard tales of a shadowy figure who appeared at the brink of chaos, guiding those who would follow, punishing those who would betray, and disappearing before recognition could settle. To them, Che was a protector, a specter of hope, a ghost who embodied both the promise and peril of unwavering ideals. The forest itself, dense and eternal, became part of the legend, as if the jungle had claimed him but also elevated him, making him a presence that belonged as much to myth as to reality. For Che himself, in the moments of reflection that punctuated his solitary journey, the legacy was personal and private. He had witnessed the fragility of life, the imperfection of men, and the relentless indifference of the natural world. He had endured betrayal, disease, and isolation. And yet he had survived, adapted, and persisted. The ghost he had become was not merely a story for others. It was proof to himself that the human spirit, when tested in extremity, could endure beyond expectation, beyond recognition, and even beyond hope. As the sun rose over the endless canopy, casting dappled light across the jungle floor, Che continued his silent passage. Invisible, untethered, enduring, he embodied a paradox. The man who had sought to change the world, who had vanished into the wilderness, yet whose presence would resonate across continents and decades. In the end, the Ghost of Congo was more than legend. He was a testament to the relentless pursuit of ideals, the endurance of the human spirit, and the haunting beauty of a life lived on the edge between vision and reality. The world may never know where he went, or whether he survived beyond the shadows of the jungle. Yet his legacy, like the echo of footsteps on an unseen path, remained, a spectral reminder that some men, some ideas, and some sacrifices cannot be contained by time, geography, or mortality. Che's life and his vanishing had become inseparable from myth, forever haunting the conscience of the world he had sought to change.